Hi everyone, how's it going? Team here, and today I want to talk about how to use RxJS together with React hooks. This video assumes that you are familiar with React and feel at home with React hooks. So let's start by talking about what is RxJS and observables. RxJS is a reactive extensions library for JavaScript, as it says on the website, and it's essentially a library for reactive programming using observables. If you are not familiar with all of those concepts, don't worry, we're going to go over them in a minute. Now let's start by talking about what is observables. Observables is basically an idea of an invocable collection of future values of events. I like to think about it this way. So you have a promise, and promise can only resolve one time, right? So it can either be a rejection or a fulfillment, but it will only resolve once. While observable have an option of actually sending more than one value or event over time. And this is essentially what you have to know about observables, right? The cool thing is that observables are actually in process of getting standardized into ECMAScript. There's been some problems with the proposal and it's still stuck on a stage 1, but it's coming to the language sooner or later, at least that's my opinion, and there's like a lot of effort put in the proposal. So if you're curious, the links to all the websites that I'm showing are going to be in the video description in case you want to check them out for yourself. All right, now that we got the basics out of the way, let's just jump right into Code Sandbox and see how exactly do you use RxJS and observables in a standalone fashion, right? So I'm just going to create a new vanilla sandbox. I'm going to add RxJS here as a dependency, and that's basically all we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement a very basic observable that will show us the numbers, right? So I'm not even going to render it in this case. I'm just going to import from RxJS. So this is the from operator allows you to create observables from other iterable things or in some other special cases like promises. In this case, we're gonna create a new numbers observable, right? And we're gonna say from array, and in this case it's just gonna be numbers. So very straightforward, nothing super fancy here, right? Now let's say we want to actually do something to those numbers, right? So let's say we want to have squared numbers. So how would you go about that? Squared numbers is going to be equal. Now we're going to take our observable and pipe it to operators, so-called operators, which is basically modification functions, which is something we can import from RxJS/operators, right? In this case, let's say we are saying we want to square numbers, which means that we want to square them, which means we need the map function, right? So we're going to pipe it to the map function that takes in a value and then does something to this value. Since we're squaring them, we're going to do exactly that. So it's going to be squared numbers, right? Now, if I try to console log this, squared numbers, we're actually not going to see the numbers themselves, but we're going to see the observable. This is exactly what I was talking about before, so it's a primitive, right? Now, what do we do actually if we want to see the real numbers? We have to subscribe to it. So this is one of the things of the observables. To consume it, you subscribe to it, right? So we got the result, and if we console log the result in this case, you're going to see that we print out the values one at a time. So this happens for each value, right? The whole pipe happens for each value. It's also lazy. This is like one of the strengths of the observables. They are executed lazily, which means that, okay, say we have this, right? Say we want to filter. So we're going to auto import the filter function from the observable operators. And say we want to say, okay, we want all the values that are larger than 2. What the laziness means is that actually the square, the map that we defined here, it's only going to be executed after the filter is done. So it's not going to do any work, whatever the complex pipelines you have there after the filter, on any of the values coming before that. This is like one of the biggest things about the observables, right? This is the basic usage, so it's very straightforward. Worth noting that basically once you subscribe, you get the subscription object, and you can unsubscribe from it. So say if we want for some reason to dispose of it, right? So we're going to console log the first number we get, and then we're going to say subscription.unsubscribe, which will result in us just getting the first number, and then everything else again is going to be discarded and never executed because observables are lazy. And if nobody is subscribed to them, they're not going to do anything. Okay, so this is the basic case. Now let's talk about the usage of observables in React without hooks. So like the old standard way of doing that. So we got the code sandbox for React here. Once again, I'm going to import RxJS, and we won't actually be needing any new files here. So I'm going to just, copy this code we have over here, because let's just start with implementing the exactly same thing, but rendering the numbers inside of our React app, right? So how do you go about that? Well, in this case, we got the function component. So let's make it into a class, stands react.component, right? And this is going to be our render method. And we need another closing bracket. There we go. Okay, so now we got the class rendering as expected. So what do we have to do to work with observables? Well, first of all, we need to define the state, because it will need to be updated. So the our component has to react to the changes, right? I forgot the super over here, and we're gonna say, okay, the current number is 1, for example. Or I guess let's start with 0, because we don't have 0 in our numbers array. Right, and okay, so we defined that, we set the state. So now we can actually render it. Let's create a simple render here. Current number is this state, state current number, right? So we got that. Now we need to actually listen to the observable. So we obviously cannot just subscribe to it and never unsubscribe, because that will lead to memory leaks and problems in the long term with the app. So that means that we have to handle two things. So we have to handle component did mount, right? So this is where we set up our subscription. This is exactly what we want to do. But instead of saying that let subscription, we're going to say this subscription and store it on the component itself, right? And in this case, we're not going to unsubscribe here. And instead of using console log, we're going to set state to current number result, right? So this is exactly what we want to do. Now, this works. We get our final number because the numbers are being set dynamically. But the problem is that on every mount, on every refresh, on every page change, for example, this is going to result in more and more listeners set, right? Which is not something we want, which means that we need to clean up after us. So on component will unmount, we're going to say this subscription unsubscribe. Not too bad, right? So it works, but yeah, it's not far from being perfect, essentially, right? Let's make it more interesting. So let's say we want to see the numbers dynamically here, right? So let's, how do we do that? Well, there is a delay function that is one of the operators for RxJS. And let's say we want to see 1 number per second. So if we do that, you see it actually kind of works, but it still shows us only the last number. This is because the delay is applied to all of the values instantly, right? So we go through all of them and you set the delay for 1 second for each. And while the delay is there, it still applies it to every value, which is not something we want to see. So what we actually want to do is, again, one of the probably the most powerful features of RxJS is we want to merge map the value into a new observable that will be delayed. So there's the merge map operator, merge map, right? It takes the function that takes the value and returns something new. So in this case, we're going to say that we create a new observable from an array that only contains our value. So we're going to pipe it into 1 second delay multiplied by the number so that the delay is increased every time, right? And as you can see here, we finally have our result that is working. So we actually can see on the page reload that the number increases over time, right? So, okay, we're skipping the value 1 and 2 in this case. So we're getting 3, 4, and 5 seconds delays, but it works as expected, right? So pretty straightforward. Still, that is a lot of code to set this up, and if you would have to do that in every component that consumes observables, is just not as convenient, right? So let's rewrite that to work with hooks. First of all, we're going to change this into function again, right? So we're going to have a function app that is this, and it returns the render as before, so this works perfectly fine. This doesn't have to be a render anymore, so we can just return this, right? Let me just format this real quick. Now, instead of this state and constructor, we're gonna have a use state hook. So we're gonna just use the current number, and then we're gonna have set current number. And this is gonna be use state, which is gonna be equal to 0 by default, right? So there we go, there's our state. Now we have to figure out how to do the whole subscription unsubscription. Again, if you're familiar with the React hooks, you know that there is a use effect hook that basically does exactly what we want. So we're gonna do this, and there's our use effect hook. In this case, we only want to run it once. I'm gonna provide an empty dependencies array because nothing really changes in this app, right? Okay, so we got the subscription set up. Well, we have to change something. We have to actually return the dispose function, and we have to set the subscription to the local variable, which makes it a bit cleaner. And okay, in this case, we should use the current number over here. And instead of this set state, we're gonna use set current number. So the code is even less verbose than before. And as you can see here, it basically works as expected. So in a few seconds, we should see our values start ticking. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, it's a lot nicer when you're using hooks, a lot less verbose. You don't have to do a lot of setup. And even better, you can actually easily extract this use effect hook into a new hook. Let's call it use observable is what we want, right? And in this case, we're going to pass in an observable, and we're going to pass in a setter function because, well, observable has to set something, right? And so I'm just going to extract this here and say, okay, so we're going to listen to observable and use a setter function for the result. And in this case, since it's a custom hook, it's going to depend. So we're not going to run it once, but we're actually going to change it based on the observable and setter that are passed to it. So in this case, I can just write in my code, okay, use observable, we're going to use squared numbers, and we're going to use set current number, right? So once we save that, we should actually see the numbers working as expected. There we go. Okay, so this is all nice and easy, but so far, you know, it doesn't exactly seem useful, right? So we've been doing all those things, and it's kind of looks nice, asynchronous and everything, but how do you actually apply that in real world? Well, let's implement a real world example that is probably showcased for, well, just about every possible RxJS demo, I think. Auto suggestion, or, you know, search suggestion, basically, right? So in this case, I'm going to use the Pokemon API. So I got the URL over here, and we're just basically going to have a function that fetches, gets Pokemon Pokemon by name, right? So we're going to have a function that takes in a name, and it's going to be asynchronous. So it's going to be a promise. And then what it's going to do, it's going to fetch, await fetch our URL, so the one that I have. This is the Pokemon API, and it basically has 1,000 Pokemon, so we're just going to grab the whole array. Still asynchronous, and you know, in reality, you would have a proper API that does the search for you. But in this case, we're gonna simulate the asynchronicity. Okay, and then we're gonna get result as JSON. And in this case, it's going to be results, and we're going to name them all Pokemons, right? So we're going to extract this. And then what I'm going to return is I'm going to say, okay, all Pokemons filter Pokemon, so that Pokemon name includes our name, right? So basically just filter me everything that the API returns with the input that user provided, right? So simple enough. Now we don't really need all of that anymore, so I can just actually kill that, but that will break our app, so I will not do that just yet. Now, here's the thing. Let's implement the search first, right? So let's, I guess we can just kill that because we're not going to be using it anymore, right? So we're going to have search, and we're going to have set search, right? So this is going to be our input, and in this case, I'm just going to create input type text, placeholder search, and then we're going to have value search, and on change is going to be handle search change, because we need to do a bit more than just set the function. So sorry, set the value, right? So get our set handle search change. It's going to take an event, and we're going to get the new value. This is going to be event target value. And in this case, first, let's just set search new value, right? So this will basically allow us to type in stuff in the search box, and now we have it saved to the state, so it correctly updates. Now, while this works and everything, it's not exactly, it doesn't search for anything, right? So how do you actually do that? Well, we need to create an observable, and then we need to apply operators to it, right? So of course we could create a new observable on every user change, but that doesn't sound effective. Luckily for us, the RxJS has a very handy thing called subjects, and in this case we can take a behavior subject that is gonna be our preset pipeline for the value processing, right? So let's create a new search subject, right? So we're gonna say, okay, we got our new search subject, which is gonna have the default value that is equal to nothing, right? So this is our user. I can actually remove all of that because we don't really need that. We do need the use observable. Okay, so we created our subject. Now what we need to do is say, okay, search subject next, right? And say new value. Okay, so we pass our new value to the search subject, which means whoever is subscribed to it will actually get that value. So I'm going to create a new state, which is going to be results and set results. And it's going to be use state. It's going to be an empty array because we're expecting an array of Pokemons, right? And in this case, let me just do a div here. And I'm just going to JSON stringify results null 2, right? So that we can actually see how it looks. So in this case, it obviously looks as an empty array. Now, what we want to do is we want to use observable, right? And we're going to use our search subject. And then we're going to use set results to update it, right? Seems straightforward. So once I start typing, it should set the values, which, you know, it works, but that's not exactly useful, right? Because we don't really do anything to that subject. Now let's create search result observable, which will actually do all the work for us, right? So we're going to take the search subject and pipe it into a new set of operators that will essentially search for the results for us, right? So first of all, we want to filter the input so that value length is more than one symbol, because we don't want to search for something very short and hammer our server with useless queries, essentially, right? Next thing we want to do is we want to debounce time, and we want to say, okay, we want to only execute this after the user stopped typing for 750 milliseconds. This can be tweaked a bit, but you know, essentially if user changed his mind midway of typing, we want to wait for him to actually finish it. Next thing we want to do is we want to say that, okay, we only want to change if the value is actually changed. So if user typed something, then changed his mind, erased it, but then changed the value back again, we don't want to do the same search, right? And once this is done, we want to merge map, in this case, sorry, merge map, come on. I want to map our value to a new observable that is going to be created from our get Pokemon by name promise, right? That is going to be searched by our value. So now we need to obviously use this search result observable here, and this theoretically should give us the result. So if I go into the search box and search for Bulbasaur, there we go. So we get our JSON. Now let's actually render it correctly, because this is not very user friendly, right? So we're going to take results. I'm going to map them into a Pokemon, which is going to be a div that has a key Pokemon name. And then I'm just going to render Pokemon name over here, and that's going to be it. So very simple rendering in this case. You know, this is not focus of this video, so I'm going to be very straightforward with it. So if we search, we got the names of the Pokemons. And if, you know, if I start typing like crazy, erasing it, you can see that it actually only searches for the last bit. So it never hammers the server. It never does unnecessary work. And this is basically what's really great about RxJS observables. Right, this is basically it. I think we covered all the basic things here. Obviously, the RxJS is pretty old library. It's very popular. There's a huge community around it. So if you don't want to write your own hooks, or if you're looking for something very specific, there is plenty of existing libraries out there for React, for example, RxJS hooks that simplify working with RxJS quite a bit. So if if you're interested, if you don't want to write your own hooks, Do check it out. It might simplify your life. That is it from my side for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I see you next time. Bye.